Today we are going to learn about the Cold War. The Cold War was not an actual war, but an intense competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for world dominance. It lasted from 1947 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There were two different goals that each country wanted to achieve. The Soviets wanted to spread communism worldwide through the use of spies known as the KGB. The U.S. and other democracies had a goal called containment. This idea was created by George Kennan, and the thought was if the U.S. could contain communism to where it already existed, then it would eventually die out on its own. They also used spies from the CIA. Both sides tried to increase their power through the buildup of nuclear weapons, proxy wars, and peace treaty organizations. The term Iron Curtain would be a metaphor used throughout the Cold War to refer to the Soviet states in Eastern Europe. After World War II, Europe was a mess. This situation arose fears in the Western democracies who were afraid the poor countries would turn towards communism in an attempt to escape the hard times. In order to avoid this, the U.S. came up with the Marshall Plan. It provided for economic aid to any European nation, including those with communism, but those countries refused the help. It was a success, though, as no new communist countries were created. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones. The 3 zones in the West were united as pro-democracy countries. The Soviets had the Eastern Zone. Berlin was also divided. In June of 1948, the Soviets cut off all access by land to Berlin. In order to get around this, President Truman ordered U.S. planes to fly supplies to the people of West Berlin. Tensions were high as many feared war was going to start, but it did not, and the Soviets reopened the highways to Berlin. After the Berlin crisis, both the U.S. and the Soviets were engaged in an arms race. Until 1949, the U.S. were the only ones with nuclear capability. In the fall of 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. Another way the U.S. tried to contain communism was by forming NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. This was a military alliance for defending the members from any outside attacks. In 1955, the Soviets formed their own defensive pact called the Warsaw Pact. One of the proxy wars fought was the Korean War. We will go into more detail on the Korean War in another video. Another race between the Soviets and the U.S. was the space race. The Soviets were the first to launch a satellite into space in 1957. It was called Sputnik. The U.S. were very upset that the Soviets were able to launch their satellites first, so in 1958, Congress created the National Defense and Education Act, or the NDEA, which gave hundreds of millions of dollars to increase federal money for the teaching of science and foreign languages. It also created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. Another incident that raised tension between the U.S. and the Soviet was the U-2 incident. In 1960, the Soviets shot down a U.S. spy plane known as U-2 that was flying over the Soviet Union. This brought to light the secret U.S. tactic for gaining information on the Soviets' missiles program. This caused peace talks that were scheduled between then President Eisenhower and Soviet leader Khrushchev to break down. In a 1961 meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, Khrushchev demanded that U.S. troops be pulled out of Berlin. Kennedy refused. In August, the East Germans built a wall around West Berlin. They wanted to stop East Germans from going to West Germany. The Berlin Wall would stand until it was torn down in 1989. Also in 1961, Khrushchev made an alliance with Cuban leader Fidel Castro. In 1961, President Kennedy approved for the CIA's plan to overthrow Castro's regime in Cuba. In April of 1961, the CIA-trained Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but failed in the end. They were eventually forced to surrender, and Castro used the incident in order to gain more aid from the Soviets. In October of 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered that the Soviets were building underground missile launching sites in Cuba. President Kennedy responded by setting up a blockade of Cuba until the weapons were removed. The world feared that another nuclear war was soon to be had. Soon, though, Khrushchev agreed to remove the weapons in exchange for Kennedy promising not to invade Cuba. Another proxy war that was started was the Vietnam War, and we will again discuss this war in another video.